Hi everyone. In the first clip I described the principles of military necessity and distinction, which are the guiding principles that the law of armed conflict tries to reconcile. In the second clip I would like to talk about the principles of proportionality and distinction, which provide us at least some guidance as to how this can be achieved in practice. To begin with, the principle of proportionality is inherently flexible, and as Klabbers explains quite neatly in the chapter, it is a response to the almost infinite variety of scenarios that emerge during armed conflict, during hostilities. So imagine there are thousands and thousands of different setups, different confrontations between military forces, and the principle of proportionality provides us with a language to be able to take each and every instance on its own terms and to analyze how this balancing act between, on the one hand, military necessity and on the other hand, humanity should be assessed. So, if a particular kind of conduct ends up being too far on the side of military necessity, well, then it would be considered disproportionate and therefore in violation of the law of armed conflict. Whereas, of course, if it is too far on the side of humanity, well, then it is perfectly legal from the standpoint of the law of armed conflict, but the military might not be pursuing its military objectives in the most optimal way. Now, let's have a look at how the principle of proportionality is implemented in practice. Because, of course, I've said a few times until now that the general guiding principles find their concrete specific applications in those various treaties that I discussed in the first clip. For example, have a look at Article 51.5b of Additional Protocol 1, which deals with the principle of not just proportionality, but also distinction, to which I will come in a second. And here, an indiscriminate attack is defined as, and I quote, an attack which may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. A couple of remarks are in order here. First, an indiscriminate attack, so an attack that does not comply with the distinction principle, is considered to be inherently disproportionate. So we can see here the very close link between these two principles, as well as an overlap between the principle of proportionality and the principle of distinction. Second, the principle of proportionality, or in this case the provision speaks of the excessive loss of civilian lives and injury to civilians and civilian objects, does not provide a specific yardstick as to how much damage is acceptable and can be tolerated. As already said, the principle is inherently flexible, so it is there to accommodate the various scenarios that could arise not just under the law of armed conflict in general, but in this particular case under this specific provision. However, what this provision does do, and what the general principle does, is to create a procedural obligation, an obligation on process on the state parties concerned. So the military commanders, even the soldiers on the ground, always have to be considerate of the potential effects that their actions have on the civilians, on civilian lives and civilian objects. And if they do not do that, if they are not mindful, they will be held in breach of the law of armed conflict, even if materially speaking, perhaps the damage was not that great. Related to the proportionality principle, though also somewhat distinct, and I do think it's important to point it out specifically, is the precautionary principle, which finds recognition in the same treaty, Additional Protocol 1, in Article 57.1, which states that in the conduct of military operations, constant care shall be taken to spare the civilian population, civilians and civilian objects. And once again, we see here that there is a distinction that is being drawn between the civilian objects on the one hand and military objects on the other hand, so the distinction principle. At the same time, we also see yet again that there's a procedural obligation to do the utmost to protect civilian lives and respect the overarching principle of humanity. In general, and here we could see the law of armed conflict simply being part of public international law as a whole, there is the expectation that obligations will be fulfilled in good faith. But in the field of the law of armed conflict, this is perhaps even more important to be emphasized and re-emphasized because, of course, when these norms kick in, when the law of armed conflict becomes applicable, state parties by default find themselves in very straining, stressful conditions of warfare. And therefore, these procedural obligations need to be highlighted and stressed even more perhaps than in other domains. The other absolutely paradigmatic principle of the law of armed conflict is the distinction principle. And although I have broached it now already a number of times, I still want to repeat that it implies a differentiation at all times between military objects and civilians, civilian objects, civilian lives. that need to be protected and should not be targeted during hostilities. Note that on some level, the principle of distinction actually aligns the two contradictory principles of military necessity and humanity. It is in the service of humanity in the sense that all those who are not participating in the hostilities are to be spared as much as possible. But it also aligns with the military necessity principle in the sense that in general, nothing is to be gained from a strategic military point of view by targeting civilian objects, those that are actually not a part of any armed conflict. Now, we do know that sometimes military objectives are placed within civilian areas, or it might also happen that civilians find themselves in the midst of a battle caught between two fronts. In this case, of course, the principles of military necessity and humanity have to be reconciled once again, and whether or not the distinction principle is respected in such cases will then depend on whether the action taken is proportionate. The final question that I would like to address in this clip is who counts as a civilian? How do we define this category? And the best, most accurate answer is probably provided by offering a negative definition. So to enumerate who does not actually count as a civilian. We can find some guidance here in Article 4A of the Third Geneva Convention, which does or provides this sort of list for us. And therefore we can say that a civilian is anyone who is not actually a member of armed forces, militias or volunteer groups, or not a member of other militias such as organized resistance movements, not in the regular armed forces, not recognized by detaining powers, or indeed not an inhabitant who spontaneously takes up arms to resist the invading forces. The last aspect in particular shows us that civilian status is contingent, that it can change and even rapidly and immediately change the moment that you as a former civilian take up arms. The distinction principle will still apply, but you are now on the other side of the equation in the sense that the military can target you in order to gain a military advantage. To sum up these first two clips, the law of armed conflict is based on these four pillars, the principles of military necessity, humanity, proportionality, and distinction. Knowing about them will offer you some general idea of the object and purpose of this field of international law. And you will also be able to, when looking at specific treaties, specific conventions and their provisions, be able to understand much better what they do, because at the end of the day, they just implement in more specific, concrete terms those general principles and objectives.